Good afternoon, this is Gary Kavanagh here on TRSI with my friend and colleague Michael Dwyer. Today, Michael, is a special episode. Do you know why?
I do not know why, Gary.
Today is our 400th episode.
Seriously?
No, actually, that's what it says on all of the site and Spotify and all that. But those of you who might be a little bit old school will realise that actually before all of this, before Gript, before everything, we were around on one of the other sites, and we actually did a number of episodes there as well. So this could be closer to 500 than 400. But officially, Michael, it is the 400th episode. What have you learned over your time presenting the show?
Nothing.
Is it possible you know less now than you did before?
I'm assuming so, because I'm a human being, and human beings are incapable of learning.
Well, no, I meant, just given your age and given what we've recently seen with Joe Biden, it could be good to look for signs of loss of mental acuity.
Oh, they're undoubtedly lost. I take that as discounted. What precisely those things, I wouldn't like to speculate. I think that's for other people to point out, and they do point out regularly to me. I can't remember the names of capitals in the way that I used to. I suppose does that count? When I was 7, I knew every capital in the world. I no longer do. I know. I blame the people that kept changing the names of all the capitals just because of something colonialism or something. I don't know. It was all very upsetting. And now they change the names of countries even. And then change them back again sometimes.
For the 400th episode, being a special episode, we've got a real treat for the listeners, Michael. A long-winded discussion of things that they will more than likely never need to concern themselves with, but which seem to be of importance to us for reasons that are clear even to our colleagues.
I don't want to be that guy, Gary, but is that not a description of practically every episode that we do?
Yeah, but it's special now because we're becoming self-aware about it.
Yeah. I've always worked on the basis that there are 3 people who suffer from some kind of similar psychological damage that we do that listen to this. I don't like to speculate. There might actually be other people out there who just want some kind of noise on in their headphones when they go for their walk in the evenings, and they happen to land on us because they have their Spotify on shuffle.
This listener is why Michael never asks me about what the actual listenership numbers are, because occasionally he would ask and I would tell him, and the numbers as they grew began to terrify him.
Yeah, I occasionally, if Gary feels like he wants to get a little bit of juice in his day by spiking my anxiety, he'll ring me up and say, I just looked at the figures. Do you know how many people listened to the last podcast?
I think my personal favourite was the one where you failed to defend Malcolm Byrne, who lives in your area. And I called you up to go, Michael, just so you know, 25,000 people listen to you really badly fail to defend someone who lives right beside you.
Was it necessary to bring that up again?
Absolutely. I've got to set the tone for the rest of the episode.
You recommended, we were discussing off-air, listeners, there's an American sitcom called The Good Place that Gary recommended to me. Like, to be honest, having watched it, perfectly charming, nice. I'd recommend it if you want to watch something. Fine. Gary, however, is one of those people who would not be going to The Good Place. Because people who take pleasure in other people's pain do not end up in The Good Place, Gary.
Mm-hmm. What about the saints who can see into hell?
As you know, St. Thomas is clear on this. It says in the Summa that the enjoyment of the beatific vision by the blessed will be in no way diminished by their contemplation of the sufferings of the damned.
It actually somewhat depresses me that I did know that.
He's very clear on that, in case anybody is worried. I've always imagined a hole somewhere in the clouds in heaven where people can look down at their souls writhing in hell, and around it there's a bunch of the saved, having a look down and then going off for a G&T before dinner.
Well, let us move on and in no way explain to listeners who might not be aware of the sort of deep Catholic theology you would need to be to understand that that's an actual thing. So, for this special episode, here's what I wanted to talk about, Michael. I wanted to talk in part about the Media Commission's new Gender Equality, Diversity and Inclusion strategy for the audio and audiovisual media sector, but I wanted to use that to also talk about a couple of other things in relation to media regulation, about how some of the other media outlets are behaving, how we saw some of the media outlets behave over COVID. I just have a rollicking good ramble through, should we say, Michael, the lighter side of regulation.
Oh, it sounds like a laugh, Gary. I'm sure the listeners are excited, like as I am myself. Also, do I get the sense that Gary's a little bit pissed off?
My underlying philosophical position and temperament that feeds nearly all of my political positions is I want to be left alone.
Okay.
So when I, see something coming from a regulator that seems to want to put itself in a position to regulate Gript and seems to be trying to position itself to bring in more of the online media under its remit, and it puts out a paper on something like this, which is very clearly appearing in a context where state grants and state support are being tied to your performance on equality, diversity and inclusion, or as they call it, gender equality, diversity and inclusion, GEDI. Kind of funny because it sounds like a kind of drunk Australian man saying good day to you. That's not really what we should take from this very serious document. But everything is moving in this direction of basically pushing for particular outcomes, changes in internal circumstances, particular outcomes that will come from that. And I think, not to be precious, Michael, but given the sector that Gript operates in, I don't think the state should be telling media organisations, this is what you should be doing internally, and these are the sort of people you should be bringing in, these are the sort of outputs you should be having. And I probably important to state, although it's not actually important for how we function. Even if Gript came under regulation like this, we would be one of the best performing media outlets in the country. Like a shocking amount of our staff are women, for instance, even at the higher levels, which is very unusual for an Irish media company. Ben Scallon is obviously, he's our lead political correspondent. His father is Jamaican. Fatima Gunning is, probably our I'd say, primary news reporter at this point. And her father is, I think, Pakistani. We have people of many kind of heritages working for us. So this isn't a sort of reactive, we'd look bad.
I think John McGurk has connections from Cavan, which must count as something, some kind of ethnic minority.
I think they come under the disability requirement.
Probably, yeah. Congenital miserableness.
Part of it is that. Part of it is just, I don't think this should be happening. And it's clearly moving in a direction where state support is going to be tied to these things. But it's partially this, and it's partially a couple of other things. I view most of these things as intrinsically sexist and racist in and of themselves.
Yeah.
I think they have a particularly infantilizing view of, be it women or immigrants or whoever. A lot of this is based on kind of an underlying assumption that these people couldn't do this without help. And so if they're not going into certain areas, or if there's any sort of irregularity, that must be because, they just need that little bit of push to get over the line. I think if someone was talking about me like that, I would tell them to fuck off. That would probably be my first response. Part of it is that, and part of it is this. In Ireland, most of the media organisations are pushing for state support. They're pushing in the direction of, we want to receive state funding because our businesses are failing, and rather than take responsibility for that and try and correct the ship beyond what we've already done, we want state money to keep us going. Rather than, if the market decides we're no longer worth supporting, dying, which would be the honourable thing to do. And so you tie that where the media is pushing for state support with stuff like this. And I think that all goes in a bad direction. And you have stuff like RTE are signed up to a thing called Covering Climate Now. It's an advocacy group that teaches the media how to discuss climate-related issues. They are, as far as I can see, the only state media entity that is a member of this thing. And it has certain, shall we say, suggestions, Michael, like that you never cover a story that will make an environmental group look bad. That is an explicit recommendation of this group. And there's many recommendations there to bias, basically, output in a particular direction. RTE refuses to answer any FOIs that relate to them, saying that they all come under programming, which is a wonderful cutout that RTE has, but would also seem to suggest that they're taking some of that advice on board, or how else would it be impacting on programming? So you're starting to see a tightening and a greater focus being put on telling media how to do its job, backed by a movement to giving the media money to keep functioning. And that's where I have a real problem with this. I think on its own, it's annoying when you bundle it with the fact that some of the grant projects are tied to this and that you're going to be measured against this. And so if you decide to ignore this, you're shutting yourself off from a lot of the grants that particularly radio stations need, local radio stations. So they really have no choice but to go with this unless they can change their entire business model around.
Okay, so we're at a point where a bit like federal funding in the United States for schools or for colleges. If you want certain kinds of federal funding, then you have to behave in a certain kind of way regarding diversity, equity, inclusion, hiring, whatever. So this is going to make certain kinds of grant or subsidy contingent on certain kinds of behaviours and hiring practices or whatever. But is it your concern, or is there something actually already explicit and substantial in the document which suggests to you that this isn't going to be simply about those organisations which are in receipt of state funding, taxpayer funding, but that it may ultimately, a bit like in other countries where any company which is, say, on the stock market, quoted on the stock market, has to have certain kinds of quotas for its boards of directors. Do you think that in the long run, even companies like Gript, which doesn't take money from the state, may actually end up having to conform to certain kinds of requirements, even if actually it turned out that Gript wasn't affected by it because it turned out that its balance of, say, ethnic minorities or of women or whatever it happened to be was already within the target?
Yeah, I think that it's unclear where I think some of the limits of the Media Commission's power are going to be. They're clearly trying to regulate entities that, on a traditional understanding of some of the terms they use, would not come within regulations. I think they are clearly trying to kind of creep the line further and further. And I know that from correspondence and discussions I've had with other people, that's clearly what they are doing. Now, whether or not that was intended when the state set them up or it's something they've decided themselves, that's an entirely different matter. But even within this document, you have certain things that are already there, like the Sound and Vision funding scheme. That already has a lot of stuff about gender equality, diversity, all of that sort of stuff. But this document explicitly states that this strategy will be a key criteria for Commission Means, which is just their name in Irish because why not, funding schemes. And they also state that they expect this strategy to be implemented across the sector. So, yeah. They phrase it quite weirdly. They say that the GEDI standards will be widely consulted on, will be fair and measured, and will be informed by research overseen by their research division. And then they say this: in return, we want to see the standards take effect and make a real difference, when they're talking about the sector as a whole, which is a bit of a weird thing to say. We're going to be very fair, but in return you have to do this. Which is sort of, and if we don't, what, you'll be terribly unfair?
Also, probably wasn't the intention, but kind of carries the sense that they have already got an idea in their heads of what the outcome of that research is going to be.
That is an interesting thing, because some of the research they actually quote, they reference, is bullshit. So, for instance, one of the things they say is they want all audio and audiovisual media to put in place what they call relevant staff training that covers GEDI awareness, disability awareness, unconscious bias, anti-racism, etc. Two things there. Unconscious bias is bullshit. The research on it has been torn to shreds. The fact it managed to get through their research department without anyone noticing that indicates they're either not very good or they're coming from a very particular ideological position where that sort of research still stands. Anti-racism is also quite interesting because some really interesting research suggesting that makes staff more racist.
Yeah. Now, the research that I've seen on that suggests that if it does make them more racist, it only makes them a little bit more racist. But a little bit more racist, I would say, is not the intended outcome of doing anti-racism classes.
No, and there's a lot of talk of anti-racism, and for those who aren't aware of this, the development of this kind of area has been quite interesting. We used to have the idea of colour blindness, the idea that you should just treat people, as Martin Luther King said, by the content of their character as opposed to their skin. That became a bit of a problem in kind of the early 2000s towards the early 2010s, and you started to see this move towards what they call active anti-racism, and usually training people in this area. And that took the position that colour blindness was in itself racism, because minority groups are coming from such a negative position due to entrenched racism that basically needs to be actively countered by you going above and beyond. The problem, of course, is that in doing so, well, I think rather than give some detailed examples, I would just point at the evolution of racial relationships in America over the last decade. And yeah, I think it's pretty clear it's not working very well. Oh, and here's another interesting thing. While they say it's going to be audio and audiovisual media that comes under their remit, they also want you to apply this to external collaborators or collaborations. Well, whatever way you want to say it, I say. So if you're working with external producers, they're going to have to sign up to your internal policies on anti-racism, anti-bullying, all this kind of things, or to show commitment, as they say, to safe to create. So they're talking about bringing in particular kinds of training, applying that even to third parties. They also, and this is kind of annoying, don't understand the phrase equality of opportunity. Or they understand it, but they're coming from a deeply incorrect perspective on this. So to give a quote from this, Michael, from their definition to this, they say gender equality in the workplace implies an equality of opportunity regarding recruitment, training and promotion, and equality in terms of equal pay for equal work, which would fall, I think, inside most people's understanding of gender equality.
I would also say that that's pretty well established in Irish law already.
It's pretty well established in Irish law, particularly the equal pay for equal work part. Here's the very next sentence. Gender equality should be reflected in policies that provide balance on boards and in management. That's not equality of opportunity, that is equality of outcome, which is where you say, if they make up this percentage of the population, they must make up this percentage of the board or of management or of staff. The problem there is that that's not how things work in reality. Different populations, whether that be male, female, people from different countries, people from different educational backgrounds, people of different religious faith, go in different directions. And so you can see, for instance, Michael, there are a lot more female nurses than there are male nurses.
Yes.
The underlying argument here is that that's because of systemic discrimination. Usually phrased as systemic discrimination against women, because most of these arguments are feminist arguments, and that's kind of just where they start from anyway.
Well, yeah, it feels like this is old territory that we're just ploughing over again, but it's worth maybe remembering. A lot of this starts with the rejection of the idea that any kind of differentiation of outcome between the genders, between the sexes, male and female, had to be socially engineered, or social consequences of structures within society, because there was an absolute unwillingness to accept the idea that there might be any kind of, shall we say, biological or evolutionary outcomes which would produce differentiation within the populations, different kinds of choices. And that sense was because if we subjected ourselves to what you might call some kind of biological determinism, this could be used, or would be used, has been used in the past, as a justification for different forms of discrimination or oppression of women, say in the home, in the workplace, wherever it was. So therefore, there was a real unwillingness to accept that. Now, there has been, Gary, has there not, a fairly large amount of decent quality research that's been done in the last number of decades, which has looked, for example, particularly on the area of interests, because that seems to be one of those things that men and women seem to have different interests, and these mimic the behaviors even that we see in higher primates at infant level. So, for example, and the interesting thing is that when you look at employment choices, you get far greater activity in what would be considered in the West as traditionally male areas, say like engineering, in societies which would be considered to be less gender equal. But if you go to those societies where which would be perceived to have gone the farthest in working towards some kind of gender equality, so we're typically looking at the Nordic countries, that these are the countries where actually these differentiations of interest, which are then manifest in employment choices, actually express at a greater level in societies that are considered to be less gender equal, which strongly suggests that if you just leave people to make a choice by themselves and they don't have other strong social or economic factors at work which push them in one direction or another, that men and women will make different kinds of choices. So that the idea that that the correct outcome, and that's what is underneath all of this, is the belief that there is in fact a correct outcome. Now, if you ask these people, okay, what would the correct number of women in this area be? What would the correct number of men in this area be? They're very unwilling to give you an answer because they don't, that's a correct number. It's very uncomfortable. But really underneath it all is the idea that what you should get is a replication of that how they are represented in the general population. So if 51% of the population are women, then 51% of computer engineers should be women. And if men are 49% of the population, 49% of nurses should be women. And that just doesn't seem to be what's going to happen unless you really introduce massive levels of state coercion.
One of their recommendations, Michael, is that on-air presenters and hosts should be trained to deal with hateful and denigrating speech of guests or programme participants, including on call-in shows. Now, given the type of training that this document is about, that's going to take, shall we say, Michael, particular views on, for instance, gender that may not be agreed with by all of the population.
Yeah.
So you have the regulator talking about training the people who are interacting with the public to deal with these things in a particular way that is acceptable to the regulator on political issues, which is what the gender issue is. And there's a lot of stuff about promoting female sport and promoting female music and things like that. There's a talk of creating a database of, as they say, diversity on air, so that you have basically a debate. You know, Michael, you're running something and you're like, we've got this great political show, but we just don't have enough blacks. Consult the database, which is obviously going to have an impact on the programme. You're pulling in people partially because they have some expertise, but let's be honest, primarily because they have the right racial characteristics. So, not great on that. But there is one that I did see, and I think I actually just outright said, fuck off. And it was this: assessment of the makeup of workforce via voluntary internal anonymous surveys, which will be included in the results of annual reports to the Media Commission.
Explain?
They want you to provide your staff with anonymous surveys about how you are doing in relation to what the Media Commission wants you to do, and then provide them to the Media Commission.
Okay, so that's going to help a team spirit.
Oh yeah, I mean, what we've seen, Michael, is in the countries that adopt, or in the companies that adopt these kind of policies, everyone is so much happier afterwards.
Yeah, everybody.
And of course, it's quite interesting. They include, very helpfully, a list of the, as they say, stakeholders, Michael, that they consulted with to come up with these ideas.
The Irish Immigration Council?
Let's see. Do we have the Irish Immigration Council? No, we don't. We have the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission.
Okay, cool.
And a surprising amount of organisations who I've never heard of, but seem to be involved specifically in getting more women into media, which I don't have a problem with in general. One of the problems I have with these kind of stakeholder things is that there is an endless array of NGOs funded to promote this kind of stuff, and no one funded to go against this kind of stuff, because most people kind of agree with it. Or agree with a certain amount of it. I think if you go to someone and go, we want an NGO to promote women's rights, most people will go, yeah, that seems reasonable. Very hard to go the other direction, because a lot of the public are not in that space. But if you keep creating NGOs that sound like they come from reasonable kind of positions, these NGOs need to keep finding things to do. And very quickly, you find that they don't tend to be terribly reasonable anymore.
Yeah, but Gary, come on. The reality is, if you ask Joe Public, whoever he or she might be, are you against racism? They'd say yes. Are you against discrimination against women? Yes. Are you against discrimination against gay people? Yes. But that's not what any of these organisations, because their understanding of what discrimination might be, or their understanding of what fairness might be, or their understanding of what equality might be, will come from a worked out philosophical ideological position, which is very, very different to what the ordinary person's understanding of what fairness might in fact be.
Yeah, but Michael, that's why you don't ask the ordinary person about their specific policies. It's like when you say, would you pay more taxes in order to fight against climate change? And everyone says, yes, I suppose I would. You never ask, how much would you pay in additional taxes? Because I don't know if you've ever seen the results of those kind of polls, Michael, but it turns out most people want to pay about a tenner.
Yeah, in fact, that question was asked recently, and I think the actual answer was around €100.
No, I think €100 was
the upper limit. Yeah, that was the upper limit.
You've got your Women's Council, you've got the National Youth Council, Pavy Point, you've got a couple of LGBT groups. It's Dublin City University, I assume they mean the journalism centre there, which is it's its own thing. No real details on what they talked about, but an unsurprising kind of result from it. And this is just the start. They're going to be coming out with more stuff. They mention it here that some of the things in this are going to find their way into some of their future work on, impartiality on air, which is actually something that can be regulated quite harshly. So parts of this are going to make their way into actually quite strict regulations on media, most likely. And I think the damning part of it, Michael, is that I haven't heard a single media organisation outside of Gript say that this is a shit show. Regardless of what you think, even if you think parts of this are a good thing, it should not be something that is done to a media organisation, because media organisations have a function that requires them to be able to report largely without this kind of regulation. The more of this you have, the more one-sided you make the news. Now, at one point, Michael, that's great for Gript, because we're just going to ignore this entirely.
Sure.
But you get all of this stuff at the same time people are talking about the need to rebuild trust in journalism. And then you have things like RTE with Covering Climate Now and recommendations that you not cover climate organisations or advocacy groups in a way that makes them look bad, even when they have made mistakes. You have stuff like this saying that you have to promote certain types of programming. You have to have certain kind of things there. And all of it is artificial. And I think people realise that it's artificial. Even if they can't quite express it, they can't quite put their finger on it. I think you can see in a lot of countries where they've gone quite far down this road, when you watch their programming, it feels weird. It kind of falls into nearly an uncanny valley, where you sort of go, there's just something not right about this.
Obviously, there's so much wrong with this from my perspective, and the details and the practicalities are going to be things, but they're just two, shall I say, kind of fundamental things about it that seem to me to be really problematic. First of all, what we have here, it seems, and I know the argument will be made, well, they were set up by the Dáil and there was a vote in the Dáil, blah, blah. Remember we discussed Chevron, the Chevron case, where it had been decided because of a Supreme Court ruling that government agencies would make the decision how a particular regulation should be interpreted, even if that seemed to go against a plain reading of the legislation or the intention originally of the legislators. And that's what the courts had to bow to their understanding. What we have here, is essentially, the Commission of the Man is becoming a lawmaker. It's becoming a lawmaker and becoming a police person. I was going to say policeman there. A police person. It's setting itself up, and I do not imagine that the original understanding and the intent when this was set up, or the understanding in the broad public of what the purpose of this thing was that it was going to go to this level, or this detail, in its regulation and control of how the media operates in Ireland and how media organisations organise themselves. This seems to me to be a ridiculous overstretch of their authority, and not the kind of thing, even if it is legal, and it'll be interesting to know, as usual, a situation we could say, well, maybe there are constitutional questions, and if you could find someone with the time and the money and the standing to go to the court to ask the question, it would be all very interesting. But even if it is technically, this is just wrong. This kind of thing should not be done by an inverted commas independent body. It should be done in the Dáil. And if the Dáil decides to pass it, well, then at least, going back to what one of the points I made about the nature of good laws and bad laws is, one of the things about a law is there should be a mechanism where the people can express their dissatisfaction by saying to the legislators, we're going to punish you because you passed that law by taking your job away, and we're going to give your job to somebody else who will make this law go away. But when you have a thing like this, this is a body acting by itself and essentially operating as both a legislator and a policeman. And I think that's acceptable. And the other point, is we are importing this nonsense straight from the United States, undigested. Anti-racism is people like Ibram X. Kendi and Fright Fragility, Robin DiAngelo, and and it's, by the way, Gary, a very big business, a very lucrative business for people to go into large corporations and give these courses on anti-racism and anti-discrimination and unconscious bias and make a lot of money, but achieve nothing except possibly negative outcomes. And the notion that we have the same cultural, historical context when it comes to these issues as the United States is ridiculous.
Those are good points. I think the real danger of regulation like this is it's generally unseen by the public. And a lot of the players now have an incentive to go along with it because ultimately they want to receive money from the state. And, you don't really want to start arguing with certain things, perhaps, or, perhaps arguing as much as you would if there wasn't money potentially on the line. But to give you one more example from this, Michael, here's one of the other things they call for. They call for this to be brought in at the start of next year. They want all audio and all audiovisual media to introduce policies or code of conduct for reporting on various groups, engagement, on-air, interviews, vox pops with groups or representative of groups/communities. And you might say, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And it says it may be informed by the Code of Programme Standards and the Code of Fairness, Objectivity and Impartiality in News and Current Affairs. Also in line with the National Action Plan Against Racism, the Code of Ethics for Media Practices on the Representative in Media of Minority, Ethnic and Racialised Communities. Which is to say, they want people to regulate how they engage with largely immigrant populations. How they handle that on air, how they handle that in interviews, how they handle that on vox pops. They want a degree of self-censorship. And they're bringing that in a time when the immigration debate seems to be coming a little bit off the boil, but is still a massive pressing issue. And the majority of the public will never know that that is what they want and that media will be pushed to implement those things, thereby changing directly the nature of their output for political aims without any of the public knowing.
But also, Gary, they will have, if the public did become aware, and parts of the public did have a problem with it, this is yet another example of the subcontracting out of democracy, where, like the HSE or in the England, like the central bank, whatever it happens to be, the response will be, oh, well, that was the decision made by an independent body of experts. And this was what their advice was. The government has accepted the advice of this independent body of experts. And of course, the implication being that these are people coming from a position of neutrality. They've looked at the thing and without fear or favour, without any political influence, they have come to this. And we as politicians, because we're just politicians, we have decided to accept that because they are independent and they are expert. But it's a way of covering your arse. But because you've set the thing up, you know exactly what they are going to produce.
Oh, and here's an interesting little line which isn't in the Media Commission's report on this. You know, it referenced Action 3.2, Michael?
Yeah.
It quotes Action 3.2, but it actually leaves out the very last line of it. And it's this: and make adherence to this code a condition for public funding of media.
Aha!
Interesting point to cut that at.
Yeah. Nobody's going to say who pays the piper plays the tune.
No, I mean, part of my, as I was saying about the wider context of this and what we saw during COVID, multiple times during COVID, I worked on stories or Gript broke stories which were of interest to the other newspapers or the other media outlets. And they would occasionally just not be touched on at all. But we saw a number of issues where reporters in those outlets were very interested, went, did the work, wrote it up, and it was spiked by editors.
Yes.
Usually for reasons that weren't given. But I know, because we have good relationships with a couple of them, that one or two stories were spiked because, this is particularly in relation to some of the radio stations, they were concerned that the stories would annoy the Department of Health or the HSE, and basically newspaper and radio advertising has collapsed, and the HSE and the government stepped in and basically provided that advertising as a subsidy to the media.
Yes.
They will deny that. But those ads, Michael, ran at a higher price and for longer and in way more places than they needed to. There was obviously some element of we are giving you a hand. And we saw it directly then, where there was, and this is important, there was no indication that the Department of Health or the HSE would have cared about those stories. Whereas here, we have a media regulator that is saying, actually, we will very much care about non-compliance with this. So, how does that distort reporting? Because it'll definitely distort reporting. It'll definitely distort what people see when they go onto panel shows. Because, Michael, sometimes, you talk to the relevant people and they are all of one gender or one race or of a particular background, and those are legitimately the best people. And we've seen in other countries where you've ended up with just fucking yahoos ending up on TV because they were black or they were Indian or they were a woman. And I don't think it looks good for anyone. But in this case, I think it's quite fair to assume that this will impact on programming. Probably quite immediately.
Gary, if we were even going to go so far as to assume that this stuff was all being done in good faith and was well-meaning, well-intentioned, and we were to talk to these people who are doing this, and they would say to us, I'm sure, lads, there has never been a time when it has been more important to re-establish the trust that people have in media. It's very important for them to have trust, and that there are outlets there that are going to give them good quality informed data, whatever. Because there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there. They might, and I think people would say that to us with a straight face and meaning it. And yet they seem to miss the point completely that when you do this, all you do is continue to corrode the trust that the public has in the media that it consumes. Because once this cat gets out of the bag, even if it's not all the way out of the bag with everybody, there will be enough people out there who listen to it and they would go, well, what am I not being told? What is not being reported? What story am I not hearing? Whose side of the story am I not getting? Because the regulator has decided that does not fall within the parameters of what is acceptable to report. We talked about this and we saw this in a ridiculous fashion during the referendum campaigns. There are a certain number of mad people on the social media that will say ridiculous things, Gary, but they have an incredibly small, generally speaking, they have an incredibly small outreach. The people that had the biggest outreach, that were most responsible for the most egregious examples of misinformation, disinformation, were people in positions of public trust, in the Dáil, in government, and in the media. And I think that had one of the things that had an effect on the outcome of the referendum. But it has corroded the faith, and that's all this will do. It will just continue this corrosion. We are actually, weirdly, Gary, one of the things that slightly saves us is our proximity to the United Kingdom, where a lot of people consume newspapers from the UK. So where there is some kind of diversity within the environment of news reporting, and the access that people have to the internet and to X, where a lot of people increasingly, certainly under a certain age, will get most of their news from X rather than from the mainstream media. But from Gript's point of view, the problem is, well, it's both a problem and a possibility, isn't it? I mean, if all the rest of the guys go down this line, it's a great sales point for Gript to say, well, actually, we're the only people that are just not going to put up with this, and we're going to tell you the truth as we see it. And also, Gript is upfront about, shall we say, its position or its disposition. People know where it is, and they can factor that in when they consume it. The problem is that you're only going to, even if Gript does really, really well, I hope it does, it's still only going to reach a certain part of the population, and you're going to get a kind of a hegemonic effect on the news that's going out to the broader public, and Gary, that's not a good thing.
No, I mean, you're right. This is a great business opportunity for Gript. In the same way, when the state eventually brings in public funding of newspapers and we get to stand up and say, well, we've never accepted state money, we're going to refuse it if offered, we're not going to take this. It will be, again, a great opportunity for us. Now, whether or not it will make up the loss in rejecting that money, I don't know. But one thing I think there is the editorial team and the writing team and the journalists of Gript disagree on many things internally. Many, many things. I think there is absolute unanimity on the idea of rejecting state funding in any form that might come out, because it is so clearly distortionary. But yeah, it's a good business opportunity for Gript, but it's terrible for the country.
Yes.
There is actually an argument that you should be able to trust media. I think the reason that people don't trust media is largely because of media itself and how it is acted. But in an ideal world, it would be trustworthy. You would have different positions, but you could trust that each was providing a representation of the world that was honest, if different because of the viewpoint they're coming from. That's not what this is. This is bias things at a level where the public can never see them. So they can never tell if what they're seeing is an honest appraisal or a nearly honest appraisal that has been, Michael, slightly amended in order to highlight certain elements of the story in a way that just happens. And I think that's the real damaging part here. Once you start doing it, the public can't tell when you are doing it and when you are not.
But I think it also goes beyond the actual stories that they hear. I'm not a great fan of Noam Chomsky, but I think Chomsky talked about this idea of manufactured consent, where what would happen in media is not so much that there would be control of all the stories and the stories would be censored, but rather certain stories just would never appear. But what you would have was this narrow band where you would have a certain number of acceptable stories, and within that band there would be debate and disagreement and dispute, and people would say, look, we have a media, we have a free media, and they're disagreeing about all these things. But actually it's a kind of a fake disagreement because it's only happening within certain boundaries. And the problem is not the stories that people hear about that they see the debate, but rather the stories they just never get to hear about at all.
Also, just as a really petty personal gripe, they use language that I hate the concept of. Like, inclusion is an act of choice and a set of behaviours aimed at creating an environment where everyone feels like they belong and that they can thrive, is a direct quote from this document. Which is one of those wonderful things which, it's like a hallmark saying, you say it, and as long as you don't think about what you're saying and whether or not it makes any fucking sense in the context of a media outlet, everyone can feel really good about themselves. So, Michael, do you have something you want to talk about in the last 5 minutes?
The last 5, okay. Well, we could have talked about the UK elections or the two opinion polls that have come out, and just very briefly mention the fact that Sinn Féin in the last one are down 4 to 18%, which is kind of cataclysmic, Gary. Fianna Fáil up 3 to 20, and I think it's fairly uncomplicated there. Fine Gael are getting votes from people coming out to Fine Gael a little bit, but Fianna Fáil, I think we could speculate without too much risk of being accused of being crazy. that Fianna Fáil are maybe picking up some votes from Sinn Féin that they had lost. I think the sense that they had done well in the Europeans has helped them, and I think that the sense that Sinn Féin have done really badly, has damaged them. That Sinn Féin decline seems to be ongoing. We have no sense yet where the basement might be. We could speculate, if it keeps going like this, will Mary Lou feel that it's time to move on and maybe some fresh face to come in to try and reinvigorate the party? That's all right. But the one thing I did want to just, it's came out there the week before last. I don't know if you saw the stats came out from Eurostat, Gary, talking about the median or the average cost of living across the EU.
Yes, I believe we are sadly still losing out to Switzerland.
Well, Switzerland, we are probably losing out to, but Switzerland is not in the EU, but Denmark is, and we were pipped, Gary, from the gold medal because the Danes had, I think, 144% above of the European average for cost of living, whereas we came in at 143%. And I suppose the kind of interesting thing was to look at the areas where we were expensive. Now, none of this, I think, will surprise anybody. Why we were those things that made us dear. For example, alcohol, tobacco, rents, housing, these kinds of things. I think it would have been interesting, just a technical point, Gary, that if they'd included the mean, but also the median, it would have been interesting to see what the median was about costs. So the two areas where we were doing better were clothing and I think groceries. We were quite low. We're towards the middle, towards the average there. Now, the reason I thought was interesting was lots of it. I think lots of reasons why it's interesting, but two things. There was a poll recently, I think we looked at it, Gary, where it looked at what were the principal concerns of the voters at the moment, right? And by a distance, the two biggest concerns are housing and immigration policy. The cost of living crisis, as the media have titled it, is only 5 or 6%. It's really not a big thing. And I just wonder, if we keep going at this kind of level, how long that's going to go. Because in the famous words of James Carville back in 1992, at least it used to be the case when it came to elections, it was the economy is stupid. Now, you could certainly argue, and with good reason, that the housing crisis and potentially the rental crisis and immigration, which feeds into the housing issue and to the wider issue of services and the provision of social welfare, etc., do feed into the wider economic issue. And a lot of things in the economy are downstream of housing. But I think it's interesting that I have been wondering, why is it that people are not as horrified or shocked as they should be about the fact that we are second in Europe when it comes to cost of living? Now, I think partly it's because we've kind of come inured to this idea of rip off Ireland and everything is dear. But I think part of it, Gary, is that we also think that we are richer than we are. That there's a sense, we're a very rich country. We're a very successful country. We're doing really brilliantly. So we are inevitably going to be expensive. Now, we are more expensive than in Norway, for example.
Yeah, I think part of the problem there is that the Irish economy is so distorted by multinationals. And I mean, you see that in the issues with GDP and GNI, that it's very easy to pull together stats that say actually people are doing fantastically well above the European average. And it's also not terribly difficult to cut those stats in a way which makes that look to be very much not the case. So I think there is an issue there as to what is the more accurate interpretation of the data. And a lot of this is kind of ideological as well. I think it's quite clear that the averages are drawn upwards to a degree. It's a question of how much.
That's absolutely right. So there are lots of different figures you can use. But if you look at you start at one end and keep going. You start off with GDP, and then you've got GN, which is gross domestic product per capita. Then you've gross net, and then you've got is GNI, which is gross national income, and then there's what the CSO is using now, which is a modified gross national income. On all of these figures, irrespective of which you use, while they do go down, they are. If you start at GDP, then GNP, then GNI, then GNI modified, they do come down, but we still are very close to the top of the table, up near Luxembourg. The figure I think we should be looking at is the one which is used by Eurostat and others, which is the median equivalized disposable income, because that gives you a real sense of the actual wealth of people. And if I was looking at the Eurostat's figures for the median equivalized disposable income in 2002, which is, as they say, PPS, which is purchasing power standards per inhabitant. So that gives you, and if you look at that, Gary, that gives you that's a very interesting one. So if that's the area we're looking at, the per capita disposable income on that, we come out at between 17,000 and 21,000 euro per capita. Now, leaving that aside, what that raw number by itself, it means nothing. But just as a comparator, Austria, Switzerland, Germany, Belgium, Holland, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, and Norway and Iceland are all doing better than we are. We are in the same category as France, Spain, Italy, Finland, Cyprus, and Sweden. So I'm not saying that we're not doing well. Ireland is doing well. And in fact, I mean, I was looking at some stats there for increases in wages, in salaries, right? Mm-hmm. And so there was I think it was also, it's the European Commission numbers, changes in inflation for inflation adjusted wages per employee from 1990 to 2003. And we come out at over 50-55% of increase in wages adjusted for inflation over that period, 1990 to 2003. So, which is higher than the United States, weirdly, because the United States tends to do better on these things than pretty well everybody. Although I suspect if you did that from 2002, it might look different. United Kingdom. Italy has declined. Now, it's the only one. Greece has a tiny increase. Luxembourg, small. Italy's declined. It adjusted for inflation. Wages per employee are down 4% in Italy, which is incredible. But so I'm not saying, I mean, if you look at our life expectancy figures, look at lots of things. Ireland is doing well, but we're not doing as well, I think, as a lot of the numbers tell us. And one of my concerns is, I'm sure you saw the figures that were released recently for the first 2 quarters for corporate corporation tax. And they were well ahead. They were well ahead of projections. And yet again, the government has extra money to play around with. But Gary, and I know that you may be tired, certainly, and others are. The problem is there is no strategic understanding, it seems to me, of how fragile that money is. If we go back to the point, and we can finish up on this, just to think about this point. I think we mentioned before that there was a recent report which suggested the next few years, 270 billion euro is going to be invested by tech companies around data centers and supporting the cloud, right? The estimates for the energy consumption which is going to be required for the processing needed to deal with AI is massive. Energy is absolutely critical to the future of the Irish economy. An understanding of how we are going to provide an expanded and a significantly expanded and stable baseload energy production in this country, right? And yet we have reports from FOIs, from companies in the sector like Amazon and others saying that they are seriously doubtful about their medium-term investment prospects in this country because we cannot guarantee energy. Gary, if we get to the point that right now we're not building nuclear, we're not importing gas, we're not building new gas, we're not exploring for either gas or for oil. We are absolutely betting the house right now, it seems, on renewables. And when we say renewables, really we mean wind. And no other country in Europe is doing that. Starmer has been elected in the UK with a promise. They're going to work through net zero. There's an interesting story there, but nuclear is going to be a big part of their plan going forward. And increasingly, across the developed world, nuclear is back on the agenda as going to be part of providing stable, expanded energy production and moving towards net zero. I don't know, did you see that story? There was a telephone call intercept that was recorded with the talking about the energy plans, and they said that the figure that the press had got hold of was 28 billion, but in fact it was going to cost hundreds of billions.
I had not, but that is deeply unsurprising to hear.
I raised that only because if that's true in the United Kingdom, it's also true here. There's deep dishonesty, either dishonesty or an unwillingness to face up to the cold, hard realities of what net zero by 2030 would imply. We're six years out now, Gary. We're nowhere near achieving the targets, and the costs that are going to be incurred by this economy and all of Europe are going to be absolutely savage until we realise that this is just impossible. We're either going to sacrifice ourselves on the altar of this thing and just say, okay, we're just going to be poor, or we're going to have to re-understand everything about how we're going to get there. Anyway, that was the point. We have become too comfortable in thinking about that we are very rich and that we're always going to be very rich. We have not developed underneath the multinationals. We have not developed a domestic economy, which is a parallel economy. Gary, you've seen the figures, say, for the average wages between domestic and multinationals. It's massive.
Yeah, I mean, then when you break those down further, because the domestic is also, there's a public-private split as well.
And unlike many other countries in the developed world, you get higher average salaries in the public service rather than the private.
What a time to be alive, Michael.
Indeed. It is a wonderful, wonderful time to be alive. But, we are alive. So, I would say we have no choice. We do have choices, but yeah, it's considering the alternatives, we're doing okay. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the UK and the North. Now, Sinn Féin, biggest party and all that.
Sinn Féin, biggest party, collapse of the SNP. I mean, collapse of the Conservative Party, but people seem really upset about the nature of first past the post government. And that Labour were able to win such a massive amount of seats on a relatively, I mean, not a bad showing, but not nowhere not commiserate with the amount of seats they got at all.
Well, yeah, Gary, come on. I mean, not a bad showing, I think, is being kind. The percentage of their vote, they got, 33.8% of the vote.
And they got about 64% of the seats?
Which is an increase of 1.5%.
I mean, there are obviously problems with first past the post. It tends to work best in kind of two-party systems. And you saw that here. Renew took a lot of the Conservatives' votes, although the Conservatives saying, if Renew wasn't there, we would have been okay. Maybe it would have been. Maybe those people would have voted elsewhere. Maybe they just wouldn't have voted. I think it's very kind of reductive to assume without them we would have just, if not won, kind of come close to what we had. But I think, and this is a point John McGurk has made, and I think he's absolutely right on this one. One great thing about first past the post is it's very easy to punish the government. Very, very easy. Whereas trying to get an Irish government out of power is like trying to get a limpet or a barnacle off the side of a ship. It just keeps going. Like, the ministers in this government and their ability to survive scandals, Michael. So, for instance, Stephen Donnelly, there's a piece on him, I think, in the papers today, saying that Stephen Donnelly is going to ban all disposable vapes because he wants to come down on the industry like a ton of bricks.
Yeah.
Let's compare that to the story we had during the week, Michael, where money was set aside for the treatment of children with scoliosis, and it wasn't spent that way. And the groups who were involved in the care of those children say that they informed Donnelly of this, and he would not meet with them or even acknowledge their letters.
Yeah.
And then turn around and say, oh, all of this money that was meant to be going to this thing seems to have gone elsewhere. That's terribly sad, isn't it? While children suffer from a degenerative condition in which prevention is very much better than attempts at a cure, and he just walks it off. And you see this with McEntee, you see it with all of their people. They just keep going. Whereas the Conservatives, okay, yeah, you had a good run, but eventually the hammer came down, and when it came down hard.
I know the point that people like to make about, oh, well, it's a great because you can kick them out, you can give them a kick. The thing is, I think that ignores that what actually happens is the first past the post rewards regional strength. So you take to me, the figure isn't so much about the size of the Labour majority, although that's interesting. And okay, the Conservatives have got a kicking. I question the wisdom of saying that it's a good thing that a government with 34% of the vote of the country gets the kind of majority that it means that in the first 6 months it will be able to do anything it wants. Just plough it through. Now, having very large majorities will create its own problem as it gets later on in the day in the government. Jack Lynch discovered that after, under a PR system, the Cosgrave government got an absolute kicking by the government, the electorate in 1977. Having too many people on the backbenches created problems for him. No, the number that I find, if you want, kind of shocking is the number. The Lib Dems got 12.2% of the vote, and Reform got 14.3% of the vote.
The Lib Dems got 61 MEPs?
Or 71, I think. I'm not sure, but I think it was 71. And Reform got maybe, 5? Now, the reason is the Lib Dems have historically been strong in the southwest and in the south and parts of these. So, because they have a strong regional presence, when there is a swing against the state, they will benefit in those seats where they're second. But because Reform were spread more evenly out the country, rather than, and that, for example, that's what benefited the SNP. The SNP, obviously, all their votes were in Scotland because that's where only place they stood, and they get this massive benefit because of that. So I don't know. It just seems to me there's something about I think that our own system, which maintains both the constituency element and the reform, and for a very long time produced very stable governments. For a long time, Irish politics was very like English politics. You had two large parties and a small party. You had Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, and then a bit of the Labour Party. Like in England, you had the Tories, the Labour Party, and the Liberals. And it's also not true that it inevitably, it produces clear-cut results. The 1970s were a series of very tight, almost, and then people getting into government with the support of the Unionists, but not with absolute majorities. Then the Labour Party had the Lib Lab Pact with Callaghan. So it doesn't always necessarily produce these very wonderful clear-cut results. But you know what? Everybody has their own system, and every system has its problems, and this is what the English do. And every time they're asked, would they like to change, they say no. So if they're happy with it, let them go. Let them enjoy it.
And the referendum they had, probably, about 10 years ago now?
Yeah, under Cameron and Clegg.
Was a beautiful moment of politicking. For those who can't recall, the Lib Dems and the Conservatives went in together, and one of the requirements of the Lib Dems coming in was that a referendum would be held on moving to proportional representation. And the Tories agreed to it. And then when they held it, the Tories campaigned against it and said we would run it. We never said we would support it.
Back in the day, we had the opposite version of that. Fianna Fáil were very interested, you'd be amazed, Gary, to discover. They wanted to move towards a first-past-the-post system. I'm just talking about the way politics works. I'm sure on one occasion they had the referendum was held on the same day as the presidential election. And Dev won the presidential election, but lost the referendum for first past the post, which shows that voters are capable at times of actually saying, well, we're going to vote Fianna Fáil on that, but on this, no, we like our system, and we think that if you did that, then Fianna Fáil would be in power forever. So we're not going to give you that.
I think just on the complaints people raise against it, obviously it's not a perfect system. Obviously there can be all sorts of issues with it. That's really just democracy, I think. And on the regional strength thing, you saw this with the Lib Dems, you saw it with Labour, you also saw it in reverse with the SNP. They started pulling people from certain constituencies as it got towards the end. Constituencies where they had just said, we're not going to win there. The Lib Dems had an internal target of, I think, 60 seats. They nearly got that bang on because they ran a lot of people they knew weren't going to win, and then started pulling resources from those people as it got towards the end. So, it's like when people complain about the Electoral College in America. You know the rules of the game you're dealing with. You've built your parties on that basis.
Yeah,
like you run with the rules of it. And it didn't save the SNP. I mean, the SNP went from, 47 seats to 9?
And having been at the election before that, I think they got 59 out of 60. I mean, some crazy result. They just swept the boards. But they suffered.
This is perhaps why you don't want images of police turning up to dig up the garden of your ex-leader because of a concern about where money may or may not have gone.
Yeah, I don't think that helped, but I think ultimately Scottish politics has historically been robust. And I think really what got them was the relentless pursuit of a badly articulated progressive agenda. And when you have the Prime Minister saying that, that Scotland just looks a bit too white, it all didn't sound, or something like that, I can't remember. But that was how it was framed by those who disagreed with him. It was this very strong diversity, equity and inclusion kind of progressive agenda. And ultimately, people got tired of it. And, not even necessarily that they disagreed with lumps of it, but they just got tired of it. Got tired of being lectured all the time. And they said, no, come on. Let's move on. But what we might return to maybe next week is, I think, more interesting question is, what happened to the Tories? And because I think there are interesting lessons there for Irish politics and Europe politics throughout the Western world. Because obviously at the moment there's a massive debate within the Tory party about where do they go now, what happened. And I think that might be an interesting chat to have. But that's not a chat we're going to have today.
No, it's not. Let's see if we can bring someone in from them. The Tory party has been fascinating to watch the last number of years because however bad it looked externally, internally, it was much worse.
Always. It's poison. Poison.
Just kind of, when you think about how successful the Tory party has been, how long it's been around, 300 years, it nearly reminds you of the old quote about the Catholic Church, that it must be a divine institution because nothing man-made could survive such mismanagement. There
is one thing I leave the listener with, and I think I'm right on this, but if I'm wrong, well then just put it down to old age. Somebody mentioned that it was the worst election result that it had since something like 1907. And I think that might be true. And in 1907, the Liberals won the largest majority they ever achieved in the Commons.
Yes. And then by the next election, they were gone.
Well...
Was it the next election? Or
no, not the next election, quite. That was 1907. By the First World War, Lloyd George had become Prime Minister. He had been Chancellor of the Exchequer, I think, in 1912. And he introduced the reforms to the Lords. Anyway, he was the last Liberal Prime Minister. And by the 20s, Labour had become the principal opposition, definitively. And Liberals basically never again were a serious party of power in the United Kingdom. I'm just saying, Labour shouldn't necessarily believe that they are now in power for a generation because they have such a majority that it would take at least 3 elections for that majority to be whittled down. The voters these days, if nothing else, are far more fluid and far more febrile than they ever were before. And some people are saying, the strange death of the Liberal Party should be the lesson for the Tories. Maybe it should be. But it could just as easily be a lesson for the Labour Party as well. They've got in, they have a huge majority. Now, if they don't deliver, they may be on the end of 5 years' time or so of a very, very rude awakening. Because it's a strange time to be alive.
I think it's quite interesting to look at how all of these parties performed in 2019 and what percentage of a seat share they got. So if you look at Labour in this election, they got 33.8% of the vote.
Yeah.
And they got 63% or 64% of the seats. In 2019, they got 32.1% of the vote. So 1.7 in the difference.
Yes.
But only won 31.1% of the seats. So you're talking about a less than 2% change in total vote totals to get more than double the amount of seats. And if you're the Labour Party, that's great. But it also means that it's not going to take a lot to knock you off. The Lib Dems, by the way, the numbers are legitimately insane. Like in this election, they got 12.2% of the vote share and got just shy of 11% of the seats. In 2019, they got 11.5%, 0.7% lower, Michael.
Yeah.
And got 1.7% of the seats.
That's just crazy stuff.
That is. So, I mean, people are talking about how badly the Conservatives did, and yes, their vote share collapsed from about 43% to about 23%. But when you actually look at how Labour did, how the Lib Dems did, they're actually relatively steady. They're within a couple of percent of where they were. And so, on one hand, you're great. You have your great majority. But it's not going to take a lot to lose that.
As a friend of ours pointed out to us recently, when Starmer was elected Prime Minister, he's the first person since they've done the polling who has been elected Prime Minister with a negative rating, a negative approval rating. Even Cameron had a positive approval rating of 13 points. So it's a very strange election. And we will return to it next week. But for now, we shall say goodbye, good luck, have a good week. The weather is coming back, so have a lovely time on the beach if you can get there.
All the best.